Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. Have you ever noticed how some sounds are so quiet they hurt? The Texas summer heat had finally broken, leaving behind the kind of crisp October evening that made small-town life seem worthwhile. I had moved to Stillwater just 3 months ago, taking over as the town librarian after Mrs. Holloway's unexpected passing. The locals were still warming up to me, the outsider from Austin with too many tattoos and not enough church attendance to satisfy the town elders. My rented cottage sat on the outskirts of town, just down the hill from St. Matthias Church, a looming Victorian structure whose bell tower pierced the night sky like an accusatory finger. The church had stood there since the 1880s, its weathered limestone facade telling stories of dust storms, oil booms, and the slow march of prairie time. I was shelving books in my living room when the clock on my mantel showed 11:55. Something made me pause, a pressure change in the air, perhaps. The kind that precedes a storm. But the weather report had promised clear skies. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to gaze up at the church on the hill. Moonlight bathed the bell tower in an eerie silver glow. From my vantage point, I could just make out the massive bronze bell within. According to town lore, it had been cast in Europe and shipped across the Atlantic at great expense. The voice of Stillwater, the elderly patrons at the library called it. Yet in all my time here, I had never heard it ring. As the hands of my clock aligned at midnight, something odd happened. The massive bell began to swing. Back and forth, back and forth. Its movement was unmistakable against the night sky. I waited for the resonant toll to roll down the hillside and wash over my cottage. Nothing came, just the soft chirp of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. The bell swung silently, its massive weight cutting through the air without disturbing it. Perplexed, I slipped on my shoes and stepped onto the porch for a better look. The night air felt unusually dense around me, pressing against my skin like an invisible fluid. As I watched the silent pendulum of the bell, a dull ache began to bloom behind my ears. At first, I dismissed it as the beginning of a headache. I'd been squinting at library inventory sheets all day. But it grew steadily, transforming from discomfort to something more intrusive. It wasn't pain exactly, more like pressure, as if something was trying to push its way into my skull through my ear canals. I took a step back inside, and oddly, the sensation lessened. Forward again, and the pressure returned. 3 more soundless swings of the distant bell, 3 more waves of that strange ear pressure washing over me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text message from my neighbor Ellie, an insomniac painter who lived in the cottage across the way. Do you feel that? Her message read, "The bell." I typed back, "It's wrong. Something about it is wrong." I looked back up at the hill. The bell had stopped its swinging now, hanging motionless in its tower. The pressure behind my ears faded, leaving behind a phantom echo of discomfort. That night I dreamed of standing in the bell tower. In my dream I could hear what my waking ears could not. a sound so low and vast it seemed to originate from somewhere beneath reality itself. A sound that made my bones vibrate and my teeth ache. A sound that felt ancient and patient and hungry. I woke at dawn with dried blood crusted around my ears. Just a nosebleed, I muttered to myself, though I knew the blood hadn't come from my nose. I scrubbed away the evidence and dressed for work, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen last night was just a trick of moonlight and shadow. The bell hadn't really moved. The pressure in my ears had been the beginning of a sinus infection. Ellie's text had been about something else entirely. But as I walked to my car, I found myself unable to look up at the church on the hill. Something whispered at the edges of my consciousness that if I did, I might see the bell watching me somehow, hanging in its tower like a massive, lidless eye. "Don't be ridiculous," I told myself as I started the engine. But I took the long way to the library that morning, driving around the far side of town rather than passing beneath the shadow of St. Matthias. In the library's back office, I found an old folder labeled Town History, St. Matthias, and began to read. Something told me I needed to understand what hung in that bell tower, and why when it moved it chose to do so in silence. The town library's archives were surprisingly extensive for a community of Stillwater's size. The folder on St. Matthias Church contained newspaper clippings, correspondence, and fragile photographs dating back to the church's construction in 1883. I spread the materials across my desk, ignoring the occasional patron who needed assistance. Looking into old St. Matt's, are you? I startled at the voice. Thomas Hargrove, the octogenarian who came in every Tuesday to read outdated agricultural journals, peered at me from across the desk. His eyes, cloudy with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, scanned the documents before me. "Just curious about the church," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Especially the bell tower." Something flickered across Thomas's weathered face, a shadow of recognition, perhaps even fear. He glanced around as if to ensure we were alone among the stacks. "That bell," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was never meant to be here." He sat down heavily in the chair opposite me, his arthritic hands trembling slightly as he leaned forward. "The original bell cracked during a storm in 1927. Lightning hit the tower. The replacement came from a monastery in Eastern Europe, somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains. The shipment arrived 2 days before the spring equinox in 1928. Thomas paused, his rheumy eyes growing distant with memory. "My father helped install it. Said it took 16 men to lift it into place. And that's when the first incident happened." "Incident," I prompted when he fell silent. "2 men fell from the tower that day. Both claimed afterward they'd heard a sound so terrible it made them lose their balance. But nobody else heard anything at all." Thomas tapped a yellowed news clipping on my desk. "It's not in the official account, of course. Townsfolk didn't talk about such things back then." I scanned the article. It mentioned the installation of the new bell, but described the workers' falls as unfortunate accidents with no reference to any sound. "The church elders decided to consecrate the bell before using it," Thomas continued. "But that night before the ceremony, it rang by itself. At midnight. Everyone in town saw it swinging, but no one heard it toll." His voice quavered. Except those who stood too close, my skin prickled. What did they hear? Nothing they could describe. My father said it wasn't a sound you hear with your ears, but something you feel in the hollow spaces of your body. Like your insides were being rearranged. Thomas rubbed his sternum unconsciously. 7 people who lived in the houses nearest the church fell ill that night. Bleeding from their ears. Disoriented. Talking nonsense about the spaces between sounds and voices from the other side of silence. I thought of the dried blood around my ears that morning. The minister wanted the bell removed, but before they could act, a fire destroyed the church records, including documentation of where the bell had come from. Thomas shook his head slowly. Convenient, that fire. Almost as if something wanted the bell to stay right where it was. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph, sliding it across the desk to me. It showed the bell being hoisted into the tower, an enormous bronze behemoth with symbols etched around its circumference. My father took this picture. Look closely at those markings. I squinted at the image. The symbols weren't decorative flourishes as I'd expected. They formed an intricate pattern of angular writing, nothing like the Latin inscriptions common on church bells. Nobody in town could identify the script, Thomas said. The university in Austin sent a linguist, but he left town suddenly after spending one night studying the bell. Never published his findings. I reached for my phone, intending to take a picture of the photograph, but Thomas's hand shot out with surprising speed, stopping me. Don't, he said sharply. Some things shouldn't be reproduced. He took the photograph back, returning it to his wallet. The church elders decided the best course was to never ring the bell at all. They disconnected the pull ropes and spread the story that the bell was merely decorative. Eventually, people accepted this. Thomas's expression darkened. But every so often, always at midnight, always during the dark of the moon, the bell moves on its own. Like last night, I murmured. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. You saw it, I nodded, then hesitated before adding, I felt something too. A pressure in my ears. You live too close, he said, his voice urgent now. The effect is strongest within a certain radius of the tower. People who have lived in its shadow too long. Change how? Thomas stood up abruptly, gathering his cane. I've said too much already. If you're smart, you'll find someplace else to live before the next dark moon. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. If you insist on staying in that cottage, line your windows with salt. And whatever you do, if you hear someone knocking at midnight, no matter who they claim to be, don't answer your door. With that cryptic warning, he shuffled away between the bookshelves, leaving me with more questions than answers and a growing sense of unease. That afternoon, as I drove home, dark clouds gathered suddenly overhead. I parked in my driveway and looked up at the church on the hill. In the gray storm light, the bell tower seemed to lean slightly, as if bending toward my cottage. A trick of perspective, surely. Thunder rolled across the sky as I hurried inside, the first fat raindrops striking my shoulders. Once inside, I found myself moving methodically through the house, checking window latches and door locks. In the kitchen cabinet, I found a container of table salt. I hesitated, feeling foolish, then proceeded to line each windowsill with a thin white trail. The storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows as lightning split the darkening sky. With each thunderclap I flinched, half expecting to see the distant bell begin to swing in its tower. But the bell remained still. It was during a brief lull in the storm that I noticed something odd about the rain patterns on my front window. The droplets seemed to be avoiding the salt line, creating a distinct dry boundary that defied the laws of physics. As I leaned closer to examine this impossibility, the room plunged into darkness as the power failed. In the sudden silence that followed, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knocking at my front door. 3 knocks. Deliberate. Evenly spaced. I stood frozen in my darkened living room, hoping I'd imagined the sound. The storm had momentarily abated, leaving an unnatural quiet broken only by the gentle patter of lingering raindrops falling from the eaves. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Hello, a voice called from the other side. Anyone home? My car broke down in the storm. The voice sounded ordinary, male, middle-aged, with the slight drawl common to this part of Texas. Reasonable. Normal. But Thomas's warning echoed in my mind. No matter who they claim to be, don't answer your door. I saw your lights earlier, the voice continued. I just need to use a phone to call for help. I remained silent, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had no flashlight at hand, and my phone lay charging in the kitchen. The darkness felt increasingly oppressive, almost viscous around me. Please, the voice said, a note of desperation creeping in. It's really coming down out here. Despite my misgivings, I felt a twinge of guilt. What if this really was just a stranded motorist? I took a hesitant step toward the door. Thunder crashed directly overhead, so loud it made the windows rattle. The brief flash of lightning illuminated the front door, specifically the narrow gap beneath it. No shadow interrupted the thin line of storm light visible under the door. No feet stood on my porch. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. I know you're in there, the voice said, all pretense of normality evaporating. It dropped an octave, developing an unnatural resonance that made my teeth ache. I can feel you listening. The knocking resumed, no longer polite. The impacts shook the door in its frame, each blow making the wood bulge inward as if struck by something impossibly heavy. Boom, boom, boom. The salt line at my front window began to glow faintly, casting a weak bluish light across the room. Outside, through the rain-streaked glass, I could see nothing but darkness. My phone. I needed to call someone. Abandoning stealth, I rushed to the kitchen, fumbling for my device. The screen came to life, illuminating my shaking hands. But before I could dial, the screen flickered and displayed a text message from an unknown number. Look up. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I raised my eyes to the kitchen window. A face stared back at me, or rather, something that approximated a face. In the dim light of my phone screen, I could make out features that seemed to shift and reposition themselves, as if the concept of a human countenance was being poorly translated into reality. Only the eyes remained constant, black, depthless, and utterly devoid of anything I recognized as human consciousness. A scream built in my throat, but emerged only as a strangled whimper. I dropped my phone and scrambled away from the window, knocking over a chair in my panic. The pounding at the front door stopped abruptly. In the following silence, I heard something new, the the slow, deliberate sound of something moving around the perimeter of my cottage, testing each window and door. The salt lines glowed brighter with each attempted intrusion, pulsing like a silent alarm system. Then came a sound from above, a scraping, scuttling noise across my roof. Something heavy dragged itself toward the chimney. I retreated to the bathroom, the only room without windows, locking the flimsy door behind me. In the pitch darkness, I sat on the edge of the tub, straining to hear over the thunder of my own pulse in my ears. A vibration began to build in the air around me, not a sound exactly, but a pressure wave that made the ceramic tiles beneath my feet tremble. It intensified until my skull felt like it might crack from the inside out. Warm liquid trickled from my ears, spattering onto the tile floor. Through the haze of pain, a terrible certainty formed in my mind. This was what the bell sounded like to those who could hear it. Not silence, but a frequency so profound it existed at the threshold between sound and something else, something our human senses weren't designed to perceive. The bathroom mirror shattered spontaneously, shards tinkling into the sink. The vibration reached an unbearable crescendo, and I clapped my hands over my bleeding ears, screaming into the void of pressure surrounding me. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard the distant church bell begin to swing. Midnight had arrived. Though I couldn't see it from my windowless refuge, I knew it was moving, cutting silently through the night air, visible to anyone watching but audible only as this bone-crushing pressure to those caught within its influence. The scuttling on my roof ceased. Whatever had been attempting to enter my home retreated, called back by the motion of the bell. I remained frozen in place, afraid to move until I was certain the danger had passed. Hours later, or perhaps only minutes, the power returned, lights flickering on throughout the cottage. Cautiously I emerged from the bathroom, my legs unsteady beneath me. Blood had dried on my neck and soaked into my shirt collar. The cottage appeared undisturbed except for the broken mirror and the chair I'd knocked over in the kitchen. Outside, the storm had passed. Moonlight shone through gaps in the dissipating clouds. I approached the front window gingerly, peering out toward the church on the hill. The bell hung motionless in its tower once more. On the ground around my cottage, a peculiar pattern had been pressed into the wet earth, a series of indentations too geometric to be natural, too alien to be human footprints. They circled the building completely before lighting away, up the hill toward St. Matthias. I spent the remainder of the night huddled on my couch, lights blazing in every room, jumping at each creak and settling sound of the old cottage. When dawn finally broke, I called in sick to work and drove straight to Ellie's cottage across the way. Her door was ajar when I arrived. Inside, the furniture had been overturned, pictures knocked from walls. Of Ellie herself there was no sign, just a trail of salt scattered across her floor, the line broken in several places, and a dark stain soaking into the floorboards beneath her easel. On the easel stood her final painting, a meticulously rendered image of St. Matthias's bell tower, the bell captured mid-swing. Splashed across the canvas in what looked disturbingly like blood were 3 words. ITC's USI reported Ellie's disappearance to the local police, who seemed oddly unperturbed. Sheriff Daniels took minimal notes, his expression neutral as I described the state of her cottage. Probably just took off, he said, snapping his notebook closed. Artists are flighty types. What about the blood? I demanded, my voice rising with frustration. The broken furniture. Sheriff Daniels surveyed the room with practiced indifference. Could be paint. As for the mess, well, creative types live chaotic lives, don't they? He refused to consider the possibility of foul play, and when I mentioned the church bell and the midnight visitor, his demeanor shifted from dismissive to hostile. Don't go spreading stories about Synth. Matthias, he warned, his tone suddenly cold. This town values its peace and quiet. As he spoke those words, peace and quiet, I noticed something I hadn't before. A thin line of dried blood at the sheriff's ear, hastily wiped away but still visible if you knew to look for it. I left Ellie's cottage no closer to answers, but increasingly certain of one thing. Whatever force resided in that bell tower held sway over more than just the night air. It had worked its influence into the fabric of Stillwater itself. With nowhere else to turn, I drove to the church. In daylight, Synth. Matthias appeared perfectly ordinary, a well-maintained Victorian structure with stained glass windows and a neat graveyard extending behind it. The bell tower rose from the northeast corner, sunlight glinting off the bronze behemoth housed within. The church door creaked as I entered. The sanctuary was empty except for an elderly man polishing the wooden pews, the caretaker, I presumed. He looked up as I approached, his weathered face splitting into a welcoming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Welcome to Synth. Matthias, he said. Don't believe I've seen you at Sunday service. I'm not here for worship, I replied, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. I'm interested in the bell tower. His smile remained fixed, but something shuddered behind his eyes. The tower's not open to visitors. Structural concerns, you understand. I don't need to go up. I just want information about the bell itself. Its history. The caretaker's cloth moved rhythmically over the wood, back and forth, back and forth. Nothing much to tell. Decorative piece, that's all. Never been rung in living memory. Then why does it move at midnight? The question burst from me before I could reconsider. His hand stilled. Excuse me, I've seen it swing. Others have too. But it makes no sound, at least not when you can hear with your ears. The caretaker straightened slowly, his expression hardening. I think you should leave. What happened to the linguist from Austin? The one who came to study the inscriptions. A muscle twitched in the old man's jaw. I don't know what you're talking about. People are being affected by it. My neighbor is missing. I was attacked last night by something live, he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For your own sake, I stood my ground. Not until I get some answers. The caretaker's eyes darted toward the entrance behind me. Before I could turn, something heavy struck the back of my head. My vision exploded into stars, then darkness. I awoke in my own bed, sunlight streaming through the windows. For a disorienting moment, I wondered if everything, Ellie's disappearance, my confrontation at the church, had been a vivid nightmare. Then the throbbing pain at the base of my skull confirmed otherwise. Rolling over, I discovered a folded note on my nightstand. Inside, written in shaky cursive, the bell must be fed. It has been this way since 1928. Once per generation is usually enough. Midnight, dark moon. Don't interfere or you'll be next. A friend I crumpled the note in my fist, rage temporarily overcoming fear. They had taken Ellie. The town, or at least certain elements within it, were complicit in whatever malevolence emanated from that tower. Checking my phone, I discovered I'd been unconscious for nearly 24 hours. It was now late afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent. On impulse, I searched for Carpathian monastery bell and silent bell phenomena. The results were sparse but chilling, folktales of bells cast with cursed metal, designed not to call the faithful to worship, but to open doorways to places beyond human comprehension. One account from 1760s Hungary described a bell that moves in silence yet calls with voices only the marked can hear. Those who answered its call were never seen again. The monastery itself had been destroyed during a peasant uprising, its arcane practices condemned by the church. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the pressure building again, that subtle change in the air that preceded the bell's movement. My ears began to ache in anticipation. I couldn't stay in the cottage another night. Gathering essential belongings into a backpack, I headed for my car, intent on driving as far from Stillwater as possible before midnight. The engine refused to turn over. I tried again and again, increasingly frantic as darkness gathered. Finally, I popped the hood and found the distributor cap missing, neatly removed by someone who knew exactly how to disable a vehicle. Looking up from the sabotaged engine, I saw lights flickering on in houses across town. Doors closed, curtains drawn. Stillwater was battening down for the night, leaving me alone on the darkening street. With no other options, I began walking toward the highway, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look up at the church looming over the town. If I could reach the truck stop at the junction, perhaps I could find help, or at least sanctuary until dawn. I had barely reached the edge of town when I heard footsteps behind me, many footsteps, moving in perfect unison. Risking a glance over my shoulder, I saw them, a procession of townsfolk walking up the hill toward St. Matthias. Their movements were stiff, mechanical. At the head of the procession was Sheriff Daniels, and beside him, supported between two blank-faced deputies, was Thomas Hargrove, his elderly face contorted with terror. They were taking him to the bell. I ducked behind a hedge, watching in horror as the procession passed. Every member moved with the same unnatural gait, their faces expressionless except for Thomas, who struggled weakly against his captors. A terrible understanding dawned. The note had mentioned once per generation. Thomas had been too free with information, too willing to share the town's dark secret with an outsider. Now he would pay the price. I should have kept walking toward the highway. I should have saved myself. Instead, I found myself following the procession at a distance, driven by some mixture of horrified fascination and the irrational belief that I might somehow help the old man. The church doors stood open, welcoming the silent parade of townsfolk. I circled around to the cemetery, searching for another way in. A small side door, likely used by the caretaker, was unlocked. I slipped inside, finding myself in a narrow corridor that led toward the sanctuary. Voices drifted down the hallway, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Peering through a crack in the doorway, I beheld a scene from some medieval nightmare. The townsfolk had formed a circle beneath the bell tower's interior opening. Thomas knelt at the center, head bowed. Above them all hung the massive bell, visible through the tower shaft, poised like an executioner's blade. Standing before Thomas was a figure in ceremonial robes, the minister, I presumed, though his face was concealed by a hood. In his hands he held an ancient book, its pages yellowed and brittle. "The bell requires sustenance," the minister intoned, his voice carrying clearly to my hiding place. "The voice of still water must be fed if it is to continue its protection. I leaned closer, straining to hear. For nearly a century it has stood guard at the threshold, keeping them at bay. The spaces between worlds grow thin at the dark of the moon. The bell maintains the boundary. Without its vigilance they would pour through. The minister raised his hands toward the bell. But such power demands sacrifice. A willing sacrifice freely given. Thomas's voice weak but defiant. "I never agreed to this. You spoke of the bell to an outsider. You broke our covenant of silence. By our laws that constitutes consent." The chanting intensified. The air in the church grew heavy, charged with that same pressure I'd felt during the bell's midnight movements. My ears began to throb painfully. Above them, imperceptible to anyone not watching for it, the massive bell began to stir in its cradle. What happened next unfolded with nightmarish clarity. As the bell's swing gained momentum, a distortion appeared in the air beneath it, a shimmering, vertical tear in reality itself. Through this impossible aperture came a sound that bypassed my ears entirely, resonating directly within my skull. Not a tone or a note, but something more primal, the auditory equivalent of absolute darkness. The townsfolk tilted their heads upward in unison, their expressions rapturous. Blood began to trickle from their ears, running down their necks in rivulets that stained their collars crimson. Thomas screamed as invisible forces lifted him from the floor, drawing him upward toward the swinging bell and the rift beneath it. His body contorted unnaturally, as if being examined by curious, unseen hands. I must have made some sound of horror, for suddenly all heads turned in my direction. Dozens of blood-streaked faces stared at me with empty eyes, their mouths opening in perfect synchronicity. "Join us," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing with that terrible pressure knot sound emanating from the bell. Hear the voice of still water, I ran. Behind me, the church erupted into chaos as some of the townsfolk broke from their trance to pursue me. I burst through the side door into the cemetery, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and that unholy bell. But as I reached the cemetery gate, I realized with sinking horror that I was too late. Midnight had arrived, and all across Stillwater, in perfect silence, the boundaries between worlds had begun to thin. The night air rippled around me as I fled through the cemetery, reality itself seeming to warp and distort with each silent toll of the bell. Tombstones stretched and contracted in my peripheral vision, their shadows lengthening impossibly across the ground. Behind me, the voices of my pursuers distorted into something inhuman, a chorus of sounds that oscillated between whispers and screams without ever passing through the range of normal human speech. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The townsfolk no longer moved like people. Their limbs bent at impossible angles, their gaits jerky and insectal as they scrambled over graves and monuments. I reached the main road and ran downhill, away from the church, away from the silent pealing that was tearing holes in the fabric of existence. Each invisible wave of the bell's influence washed over me, bringing new horrors in its wake. The street lamps flickered and died as I passed beneath them. Households that had prudently locked themselves inside now became active participants in the night's malevolence, doors flying open of their own accord, disgorging residents who moved with that same unnatural coordination, all of them bleeding from the ears, all of them calling my name in perfect unison. "The bell sees you," they chanted. "The bell knows you. The bell wants you." A car screeched around the corner ahead, Sheriff Daniel's patrol vehicle, headlights cutting through the darkness. I dove into an alleyway between houses, scraping my palms raw on gravel as I scrambled for cover. The pressure in my head built to an excruciating level. My vision blurred as blood trickled warmly down my neck. I could feel the bell's influence seeping into my consciousness, trying to reorganize my thoughts into patterns more pleasing to whatever entity resided in that bronze monstrosity. Images flashed through my mind, a monastery in ruins, monks with their throats cut, molten metal mixed with blood, ancient symbols carved by hands that weren't entirely human. I saw the linguist from Austin transcribing the bell's inscriptions, his eyes widening in comprehension moments before he clawed them from their sockets. I saw Ellie suspended in a space that wasn't a space, her body contorted as curious appendages explored her form. And I understood what the bell truly was, not a gateway or a threshold, but a two-way mirror. Something ancient had been watching our world through that bronze eye for centuries, learning, waiting. The sacrifices weren't to keep entities out, they were invitations to come in. Thomas had been right about one thing, the bell hadn't been meant for scent. Matthias. It had been contained within the monastery, kept dormant by constant prayer and ritual. When that containment failed, the bell had orchestrated its own journey across an ocean to this isolated Texas town, where it could operate with minimal interference. The vibrations intensified. I felt my consciousness beginning to fragment, pieces of myself being pulled toward the silent tolling on the hill. If I surrendered to it, the pressure would stop. The pain would end. I would become one with the voice of still water. My phone buzzed in my pocket, impossible, given the electromagnetic disturbances rippling through town. Yet when I pulled it out, the screen glowed with a message from an unknown number. The bell lies. Break its voice. Through my delirium, a moment of clarity. The bell had no voice, that was its power and its deception. It created the illusion of silence while actually generating a frequency beyond human perception, a vibration that allowed it to reshape reality around itself. But if it could be forced to truly ring, to produce an actual audible tone, perhaps its power would be broken. I dragged myself to my feet, fighting against the pressure threatening to burst my skull. Instead of running away from the church, I began moving toward it, using the shadows and alleys to avoid the searching townsfolk. Each step required monumental effort, like wading through invisible molasses. The church rose before me, the bell tower now surrounded by a subtle distortion, like heat waves on summer asphalt. The bronze bell swung with increasing vigor, each arc tearing wider rifts in the air around it. I needed to reach the tower, but the main entrance would be guarded by the congregation, still engaged in their dark ritual. I recalled the cemetery's side entrance, but that too would likely be watched now. Then I remembered something from the town history folder. The church had been renovated in the 1960s, with part of the original foundation repurposed as a cellar. If I could find the cellar entrance, perhaps I could access the bell tower from within. Moving around the perimeter of the church grounds, I located a rusted bulkhead door partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery. It groaned in protest as I pulled it open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The subterranean air felt thick with age and decay as I made my way down. My phone's flashlight revealed a labyrinth of narrow corridors beneath the church, original foundation walls and newer support structures creating a claustrophobic maze. Above me, I could hear the congregation's chanting intensifying, punctuated by sounds that might once have been human screams before they were twisted into something else. The bell's pressure was omnipresent down here, making my movements sluggish and my thoughts disjointed. I found a narrow spiral staircase built into one of the original stone walls, a maintenance access to the tower, I hoped. As I ascended, the pressure became nearly unbearable. My nose, ears, and eyes began bleeding freely as I climbed higher. The staircase seemed to elongate impossibly with each turn, as if the tower itself was trying to prevent my ascent. I paused on a landing, gasping for breath, when I noticed markings etched into the stone wall, the same angular script from the bell, carved by some previous interloper who had made this journey before me. I traced the symbols with trembling fingers, and a fragment of understanding blossomed in my fractured mind. These weren't just decorative markings or mysterious runes. They were a musical notation system, instructions for producing a counter-frequency. The final flight of stairs brought me to a small maintenance platform just below the bell chamber itself. From here I could see the massive bronze monster in all its terrible glory, swinging in its cradle without the aid of rope or human hand. The metal gleamed with an oily iridescence that no natural bronze should possess, the strange symbols around its circumference pulsing with an inner light. Below, visible through gaps in the platform, the congregation had formed a circle around what remained of Thomas Hargrove, a contorted husk, his body bent backward at an impossible angle, his face frozen in a final scream as ethereal tendrils pulled at his essence, drawing it upward into the bell. And beyond Thomas, or rather, through him, I glimpsed something else. A suggestion of vast geometries and impossible architectures, a dimension folding in on itself, trying to pour through the aperture the bell had created. Within that non-space moved shapes that hurt my mind to perceive, entities composed of angles that couldn't exist in our reality, appendages that seemed to be reaching, grasping, eager to explore our world. The minister stood at the center of the congregation, arms raised, face ecstatic beneath his hood. "The boundary thins," he cried. "Our covenant is nearly fulfilled. I needed to act." The bell had no clapper. That had been removed decades ago as part of the town's deception. But traditional bells could be rung by striking the exterior with a hammer. I looked around desperately and found an old metal toolbox bolted to the wall. Inside was a rusted maintenance hammer, heavy enough to serve my purpose. Gripping the hammer in my blood-slick hand, I climbed the final few rungs to the bell chamber. Each movement was agony as the pressure crushed against my consciousness. The bell's swing had reached a frenzied pace, each arc bringing it precariously close to where I clung to the access ladder. The air around the bell shimmered with wrongness, reality itself becoming thin and permeable. As it swung toward me, I braced myself against the ladder and swung the hammer with all my remaining strength. The impact reverberated up my arm, nearly dislocating my shoulder. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then bong. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a pure, perfect tone that cut through the pressure in my skull like a blade. Below, the congregation screamed in unison, clutching their heads. The bell's swing faltered momentarily before resuming its arc. I struck again as it passed. Bong. The minister looked up, his hood falling back to reveal a face that was no longer entirely human. Features shifted and rearranged themselves continuously, as if multiple faces were trying to occupy the same space. Stop them, he shrieked, his voice oscillating between octaves. Bong. A third strike. The rifts in reality began to tremble and contract. Whatever waited on the other side seemed to recoil from the sound. The congregants began to climb the walls like insects, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they scuttled upward toward my position. I had seconds at most before they reached me. Bong, bong, bong. With each impact, the bell's strange markings dimmed. Cracks appeared in the bronze surface, spreading like lightning across its circumference. The entities beyond the rift began retreating, their alien appendages withdrawing as the doorway between worlds started to close. The first of the townsfolk reached the bell chamber, hands grasping for my ankles. I kicked free and struck the bell one final time. Bong. The sound hung in the air, pure and cleansing. The bell shuddered in its cradle, the cracks widening until, with a sound like 1,000 screaming voices, it shattered. Fragments of ancient bronze exploded outward, several pieces slicing through my clothing and into my flesh. The force threw me backward off the platform. I fell through darkness, expecting impact, death. Instead, I experienced a sensation of passage, as if I were moving sideways through reality rather than downward through space. I awoke in a hospital bed 3 days later in Austin, over 200 miles from Stillwater. According to the staff, I had been found unconscious by the highway, severely dehydrated and covered in lacerations that resembled shrapnel wounds. When asked how I'd gotten there, I had no explanation they would believe. The recovery was slow. The doctors found peculiar anomalies in my brain scans, subtle alterations in my auditory cortex that they attributed to trauma. My hearing was permanently damaged. Certain frequency ranges now caused me physical pain, while others, ranges inaudible to most humans, became perceptible as a kind of pressure rather than sound. When I was finally released, I found a package waiting at the hospital's front desk, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper covered in those same angular symbols I'd seen on the bell, along with a note written in familiar shaky cursive, "Not all who hear the voice are its servants." Some of us have fought it for generations. The bell is broken, but fragments remain, and fragments can be reforged. Stay vigilant. Listen for the spaces between sounds. A friend that was 6 months ago. I haven't returned to Stillwater. News reports described a gas explosion at St. Matthias Church that killed 27 townspeople, including Sheriff Daniels and the church minister. The bell tower collapsed entirely. The town is rebuilding, donations pouring in from anonymous sources eager to see St. Matthias restored to its former glory. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I wake to a familiar pressure building behind my ears. I tune an old radio to static and listen closely to the white noise, searching for patterns. Sometimes I think I hear voices whispering from the spaces between sounds, warnings, perhaps, or pleas for help. And sometimes, though I tell myself it's just my damaged hearing playing tricks, I swear I can hear the faint, distant tolling of a bell that should no longer exist. It calls to me. It knows my name. And one day I fear I will answer. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Have you ever felt watched by something inanimate? As if an object could hold memories, secrets, and intentions of its own. I never believed such nonsense until I inherited my great-aunt Eleanor's colonial mansion in rural Virginia. The sprawling estate had stood since the early 19th century, its white columns and red brick exterior masking 2 centuries of history, both celebrated and unspeakable. My name is Josephine Mercer, a 34-year-old architectural historian who should have known better than to dismiss the warnings about spending nights alone in that house. My colleagues at the university had joked about my good fortune, inheriting a perfect specimen of federal period architecture. Think of the research opportunities, they'd said. None of them mentioned the chandelier. On my first night in the house, I wandered through the high-ceilinged rooms, my footsteps echoing on hardwood floors worn smooth by generations. The mansion felt both eerily empty and inexplicably occupied. A persistent draft followed me from room to room, despite the stillness of the early autumn evening outside. I reached the grand foyer as twilight faded into darkness. There it hung, the crystal chandelier that dominated the entrance hall, suspended from the ceiling by a thick brass chain. Hundreds of cut crystal pendants caught what little light remained, fracturing it into prismatic patterns across the walls. "Beautiful, isn't it?" whispered a voice. I spun around, heart racing, but found myself alone. "A trick of acoustics, surely." Old houses settle and sigh. Any historian knows this. I retreated to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner, trying to ignore the prickling sensation between my shoulder blades. The feeling of being observed persisted throughout the meal. After washing my dishes, I returned to the foyer with a flashlight, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion to examine the chandelier more closely. In the beam of my light, the chandelier seemed to pulse with an inner luminescence that couldn't be explained by simple reflection. The crystals appeared to trap light rather than merely bounce it back. Something about its construction seemed wrong, the crystals arranged not in the symmetrical patterns typical of 18th century craftsmanship, but in clusters that resembled vases. I dismissed the thought and headed upstairs to my bedroom, attributing my unease to exhaustion from the move. That night I dreamed of music. A lilting waltz played on strings, accompanied by the delicate clink of champagne glasses and the swish of silk gowns across polished floors. The sounds grew louder until they woke me shortly after midnight. Sitting upright in bed, I strained to listen. The music hadn't been a dream, it continued, muffled but unmistakable, coming from downstairs. My rational mind suggested neighbors, perhaps a party nearby with open windows carrying the sound. But deep down, I knew the house stood isolated at the end of a long, tree-lined drive, the nearest neighbor half a mile away. I slipped from bed, pulled on my robe, and cautiously descended the grand staircase. As I approached the foyer, the music grew louder. Then I saw it. The chandelier was glowing. Not with electrical light. I'd confirmed earlier that its wiring had been disconnected decades ago, but with a pale blue luminescence that seemed to emanate from within each crystal. Beneath it, on the polished marble floor, shadows moved in perfect time with the ghostly music. I froze on the stairs, knuckles white on the banister, as translucent figures twirled across the foyer. Women in empire-waist gowns and men in tailcoats danced an elegant quadrille, their features indistinct but their movements graceful. The scene played out like a projection, but these weren't images cast upon the floor. They existed within it, like memories trapped in amber. At the center of this spectral ball stood the most clearly defined figure, a young woman in a cream-colored gown, her dark hair piled atop her head in an elegant arrangement of curls. Though her face remained blurred, her posture conveyed profound sadness. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice thin with fear. The dancing stopped. The music cut off abruptly. Every ghostly figure turned toward me in perfect unison, their featureless faces somehow conveying intense displeasure at my interruption. Then the chandelier began to swing. Gently at first, then with increasing momentum, the massive fixture rocked back and forth, its crystals chiming discordantly. The shadows on the floor elongated, stretching toward the stairs where I stood paralyzed. I retreated, stumbling backward up the steps as the temperature in the foyer plummeted. My breath clouded before me as frost formed on the banister beneath my fingers. The chandelier's swinging became violent, crystals clashing against each other with sounds like breaking glass. The spectral dancers had vanished, but their absence left something worse, a heavy, malevolent presence that seemed to gather beneath the swinging light. I fled to my bedroom, slammed the door, and wedged a chair beneath the handle. For hours I sat huddled on my bed, listening to the cacophony from below, crystal striking crystal, accompanied by what sounded distressingly like distant screams. When dawn finally broke, I ventured downstairs to find the chandelier hanging perfectly still, not a crystal out of place. The marble floor beneath it gleamed innocently in the morning light. Had I imagined it all? But there, on the bottom step of the staircase where I'd stood frozen in fear, was a single crystal pendant, broken cleanly from the chandelier above. And when I picked it up, cold despite the warm morning sun streaming through the windows, I saw within its facets a tiny, perfect image of the sad-eyed woman in the cream gown, her mouth now open in a silent scream. I told myself I would leave that morning. Pack my essential belongings, lock the mansion behind me, and drive straight back to my apartment in the city. A sensible course of action for anyone who had witnessed what I had. But as the morning progressed, bathed in Virginia sunshine that streamed through the tall windows, my academic mind began rationalizing away the events of the night. Sleep deprivation, stress, an overactive imagination fueled by the atmospheric quality of a historic home. Perhaps I'd even sleepwalked. The crystal pendant I'd found lay on the kitchen counter while I made coffee, its facets occasionally catching the light in ways that made me flinch. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I found myself reaching for my phone to call Thomas Whitaker, a colleague who specialized in historic preservation and restoration. A pre-Revolutionary War chandelier. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. You need to document it thoroughly before you do anything. I'll drive down this weekend to see it. Friday seemed too far away. 3 more nights alone with whatever dwelled in the crystal teardrops of that chandelier. But I agreed, partly because I needed someone else to witness what I had, to validate that I wasn't losing my mind. That afternoon, I forced myself to approach the chandelier in broad daylight. I set up a stepladder beneath it, armed with my camera and a notebook. Professional detachment, I told myself. Document everything. Find the rational explanation. Up close, the craftsmanship was even more extraordinary than I'd initially appreciated. Each crystal had been hand-cut, the patterns more intricate than standard geometric designs of the period. I counted 7 tiers of crystals, the largest at the bottom forming a perfect circle around what appeared to be a central mirror. As I leaned closer to examine this central element, my breath fogged the reflective surface. When I wiped it clear with my sleeve, I found myself looking not at my own reflection, but at a crowded dining room. I nearly fell from the ladder in shock. The scene played out as if viewed through a window, men in formal 18th century attire seated around a long mahogany table, engaged in heated discussion. Their mouths moved, but I heard nothing. At the head of the table sat an older gentleman with silver hair pulled back in a queue, pounding his fist emphatically as he spoke. The others listened with expressions ranging from agreement to barely concealed contempt. I fumbled for my camera, but when I looked back at the mirror, it showed only my own pale face, eyes wide with fear. That night, I barricaded myself in the library, as far from the foyer as possible. I'd found a leather-bound ledger in a desk drawer, household accounts dating back to 1812. Perhaps answers lurked in these mundane records of daily life. By lamplight, I traced my finger down columns of faded ink, noting expenditures for candles, flour, and wages for house servants. Then a curious entry caught my eye. June 17, 1812, payment to Mr. Friedrich Heinemann, German glassblower, for restoration and enhancement of the grand chandelier, as per master's specifications, $175, an exorbitant sum for that period. And what enhancements would justify such expense? I continued reading, finding nothing until 3 weeks later. July 9, 1812, burial expenses for apprentice boy, accident during chandelier installation, $3, my skin crawled. I slammed the ledger shut, then immediately opened it again, searching for more information. But there was nothing, just a return to ordinary household expenses. Sleep eventually claimed me in my armchair, the ledger open on my lap. I dreamed of a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, climbing a tall ladder beneath the chandelier. In my dream, I called out a warning as the ladder wobbled, but no sound emerged from my throat. I watched helpless as he reached for a crystal, lost his balance, and fell. The sickening crack of his skull against marble jolted me awake. Dawn found me exhausted and jumpy. I made a strong pot of coffee and retreated to the garden with my laptop, desperate for sunlight and distance from the house. I spent hours researching Friedrich Heinemann, finding eventually that he had been known for experimenting with an unusual technique of embedding objects within crystal as it cooled, a practice some contemporaries had condemned as desecration. What had he embedded in my chandelier? That evening, despite every instinct screaming against it, I returned to the foyer with a powerful flashlight. I needed to know what I was dealing with before Thomas arrived the next day. Directing the beam upward into the chandelier's core, I systematically examined each tier of crystals. Most appeared normal, if exceptionally crafted. But in the third tier, I noticed irregularities, darker centers within some of the larger pendants. I positioned the stepladder and climbed up, flashlight clenched between my teeth. With trembling fingers, I unhooked one of the suspicious crystals and brought it down for closer inspection. Holding it to the light, I nearly dropped it in horror. Inside the crystal, perfectly preserved, was a human tooth. My discovery sent me scrambling through the house, checking other crystals with frantic energy. Some contained what appeared to be locks of hair. Others held tiny bones, finger joints perhaps. One particularly large crystal at the chandelier's center contained what could only be a child's vertebra. Friedrich Heinemann hadn't merely been a craftsman, he'd been practicing some dark form of preservation, embedding human remains within his creations. As night fell completely, I was still in the foyer, surrounded by crystals I'd removed, cataloging their macabre contents. I'd been so focused on my grisly inventory that I hadn't noticed the temperature dropping until my breath began to fog before me. The remaining crystals on the chandelier began to chime softly, though there was no breeze. The sound grew louder, a discordant symphony of glass against glass. Then came the glow, not the soft blue luminescence of the previous night's ballroom scene, but an angry red that pulsed like a heartbeat. The chandelier began to rotate slowly, though no draft could have moved its considerable weight. As it turned, the light it cast no longer showed dancing figures, but something far worse, scenes of violence played out across the walls and floors. A man dragging a struggling woman up the grand staircase. A group of gentlemen surrounding a terrified servant girl in the corner of what appeared to be the library. Two men engaged in a duel in the garden, one falling with a bloom of red spreading across his waistcoat. Each tableau lasted only seconds before dissolving into another scene of violence or despair. The chandelier spun faster, the images blurring together in a nightmarish carousel of the house's darkest moments. And then I saw him, the boy from my dream, falling from his ladder as the chandelier swung violently above him. His small body crumpled on impact with the marble floor, blood pooling around his head like a grotesque halo. I screamed then, the sound tearing from my throat as the chandelier abruptly stopped spinning. The visions disappeared. In the sudden silence, I heard a child's soft sobbing coming from everywhere and nowhere. At my feet lay the crystals I'd removed, their embedded relics seeming to pulse with a life of their own. The tooth appeared to be chattering within its crystal prison. The vertebra rotated slowly, as if trying to reconnect with a spine long gone to dust. I fled the foyer, leaving my macabre collection scattered across the floor. In the safety of my car, parked in the circular drive, I called Thomas with shaking hands. "You need to come now," I told him when he answered. "Not tomorrow. Tonight, what's happened?" His voice sharpened with concern. "The chandelier isn't just showing history," I whispered, staring at the glowing windows of the foyer where shadows now moved with deliberate purpose. "It's trapped souls inside it. And I think they want out." Thomas arrived shortly before midnight, his practical pickup truck looking oddly anachronistic in the elegant circular drive. I'd spent the intervening hours huddled in my car, afraid to re-enter the house, yet unable to leave it entirely. "You look terrible," were his first words as he approached, flashlight beam playing over my disheveled appearance. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to see something, but you have to promise to keep an open mind." Thomas, tall, bearded, eternally skeptical, raised an eyebrow but nodded. His specialty in historic preservation had always been firmly grounded in materials science and structural engineering, not the supernatural. But he trusted my academic rigor enough to follow me into the darkened mansion. As we approached the foyer, I felt the familiar temperature drop, the air growing dense and difficult to breathe. Thomas noticed it too, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. "Old houses have notorious drafts," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The crystals I'd removed still lay scattered across the marble floor, catching the beams of our flashlights in cold flashes. Thomas knelt to examine one, letting out a low whistle when he saw the tooth embedded within. "Well, this is unusual," he admitted, turning the crystal in his palm. "Some kind of Victorian memento mori practice, perhaps." They were fascinated with death relics. "The chandelier predates Victorian sensibilities," I reminded him. "And there's more." I directed my flashlight beam upward, illuminating the massive fixture hanging above us. For a moment it appeared ordinary, if exceptionally crafted crystal, hanging motionless in the still air of the foyer. "I don't see what," Thomas began, then stopped abruptly as the first notes of music drifted down from above. Not the elegant waltz of my first night, nor the violent cacophony of the second, but a slow, mournful melody played on what sounded like a single violin. The chandelier began to glow with soft amber light, crystals tinkling gently as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. "What the hell?" Thomas whispered, unconsciously backing toward the door. The light from the chandelier coalesced, projecting not onto the floor this time, but onto the pale wall of the curved staircase. There shadows formed into a tableau, a man seated in a chair, playing violin while a woman in a long dress stood behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Are you seeing this?" I asked, needing confirmation that I wasn't alone in my madness. Thomas nodded wordlessly, his academic skepticism crumbling as the scene on the wall shifted. The woman's hands moved from the violinist's shoulders to encircle his neck. Her shadow fingers tightened. The violin music faltered, then ceased entirely as the violinist struggled against her grip. We watched in horrified silence as the shadow man fought for his life, his movements growing weaker until finally he slumped forward. The woman's shadow stood motionless for a moment, then turned her head slowly toward us, though she remained just a silhouette on the wall. The air vibrated with tension as the shadow seemed to look directly at us. Then, with a movement that defied the laws of physics, she stepped forward off the wall, a three-dimensional shadow figure now standing on the stairs. Though she had no discernible facial features, we both felt her gaze fixed upon us. "We should go," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. Now, but as we backed toward the door, the chandelier let out a high-pitched keening sound. The shadow woman dissolved, and every crystal in the massive fixture began to glow with individual points of light, dozens of them, pulsing like trapped fireflies. "Or trapped souls." The front door slammed shut of its own accord. Thomas rattled the handle, finding it immovable. "Break a window," I suggested, but even as the words left my mouth, heavy velvet drapes throughout the foyer drew themselves closed over every potential exit. We were trapped, and the chandelier was descending. The great brass chain that had supported it for 2 centuries was unwinding link by link, lowering the massive fixture toward the center of the foyer. As it descended, the temperature plummeted further. Frost formed on the marble floor in intricate patterns that spread outward from beneath the chandelier. "What does it want?" Thomas asked, his academic facade completely abandoned now. As if in answer, the crystals containing human remains, the ones I'd removed and left scattered on the floor, began to vibrate, then rise into the air. They floated upward, reattaching themselves to their positions on the chandelier of their own accord. "What?" Completing itself, I whispered, watching as the macabre puzzle reassembled. The chandelier now hung at eye level in the center of the foyer, rotating slowly, each crystal containing human remains glowing brighter than those surrounding it. The central mirror I'd noticed earlier began to ripple like disturbed water, its surface clouding before clearing to reveal the face of a man. Not a reflection or a shadow, an actual face pressed against the glass from inside, as if the mirror were a window. His features were aristocratic but cruel, his hair the same silver I'd seen on the man at the head of the dining table in my earlier vision. His mouth moved, forming words we couldn't hear. Desperate to understand, I stepped closer despite Thomas's restraining hand on my arm. As I approached, other faces appeared in crystals throughout the chandelier. Men, women, children, their expressions ranging from confusion to terror to rage. Some mouthed words silently, others pressed ghostly hands against their crystal prisons as if trying to break free. The central face, the silver-haired man, smiled at my approach. Not a warm welcome, but the predatory grin of a spider when prey ventures too close to its web. "Josephine, don't," Thomas warned, but I felt compelled to move closer, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. When I stood directly beneath the chandelier, the temperature dropped so severely that my skin burned with cold. The mirror face of the silver-haired man expanded, pushing outward from the glass until his features distorted grotesquely. A hand solid enough to cast a shadow but transparent enough to see through emerged from the central crystal, reaching for me. Thomas lunged forward, pulling me back just as the ghostly fingers would have touched my face. The hand recoiled, and a sound like dozens of voices screaming in unison erupted from the chandelier. Every crystal vibrated at once, creating a deafening cacophony that drove us to our knees, hands pressed futilely against our ears. Over the screaming, we heard the distinct sound of crystal cracking. The chandelier was breaking apart. Fractures appeared in several of the larger crystals, spreading like frost across glass. The first to shatter was the one containing the child's vertebra. It exploded outward, sending crystalline shrapnel across the foyer. In its place hovered a translucent figure of a young boy, the same one I'd seen falling in my vision. He looked around in apparent confusion before locking eyes with me. His mouth moved, forming words that somehow cut through the screaming of the other crystals. He trapped us. All of us, another crystal shattered, this one containing a lock of hair. A woman's figure materialized, her throat bearing vivid bruise marks. "Murdered," she said, her voice like wind through dried leaves. All murdered, crystal after crystal broke apart, releasing ghostly figures into the foyer. Some appeared solid enough to cast shadows, others were hardly more than suggestions of human form. They filled the space around us, their spectral bodies pressing close as more continued to emerge. The silver-haired man remained trapped in the central mirror, his expression contorted with rage as he watched his prisoners escape. His hands beat against the glass from within, causing the entire chandelier to swing violently. "We need to destroy the central crystal," I shouted to Thomas over the din. "It's holding him, and I think he's the one who trapped the others." Thomas looked around desperately, then grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby table. "Move back," he warned the ghosts, who parted like mist before him. He swung the candlestick with all his strength, striking the central mirror crystal. The impact reverberated through the foyer like a gunshot, but the crystal merely cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. The silver-haired man's rage was palpable now, the air around the chandelier vibrating with his fury. The escaped spirits drew back in apparent fear as the chandelier's brass framework began to twist and contort like a living thing. Thomas struck again, and this time the central crystal shattered completely. What emerged was not a ghostly figure like the others, but a swirling vortex of darkness that expanded rapidly, engulfing the remains of the chandelier. From within this darkness came a howl of such profound malevolence that both Thomas and I fell back, covering our ears and eyes. The other spirits converged on the darkness, their translucent forms diving into it like swimmers into a pool. Each entry seemed to diminish the dark vortex slightly, reducing its size and intensity. "There." Fighting him, Thomas realized, watching as spirit after spirit sacrificed itself to the darkness. Last to enter was the boy, who paused before us briefly. "Heinemann didn't know," he said, his voice eerily adult in his child's form. "He thought he was preserving us, but he was trapping us with him." With these cryptic words, he too plunged into the vortex. A blinding flash of light filled the foyer, forcing us to shield our eyes. When we could see again, the chandelier lay in ruins on the marble floor, crystals scattered like diamonds on black velvet. The spirits were gone. The oppressive presence had lifted. In the sudden deafening silence, Thomas and I looked at each other, neither willing to speak first and break the fragile normalcy that had returned to the house. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "I suppose," he said shakily, "this will make quite an interesting addition to your research on historical preservation techniques." I laughed, the sound tinged with hysteria and relief. "I don't think the academic world is ready for Friedrich Heinemann's crystal preservation techniques." As dawn broke, we carefully gathered the shattered remains of the chandelier, each fragment now just ordinary crystal, warm to the touch and empty of any presence. All except one, the central mirror crystal, which remained ice cold despite the morning sun now streaming through the windows. We buried it in the garden, beneath a rose bush that, according to the property records, had stood in that exact spot for over 200 years. Neither of us spoke of what we had witnessed, but as we patted down the soil, Thomas murmured what might have been a prayer. That night, for the first time since moving in, I slept peacefully in the old house, no longer feeling watched by unseen eyes. Whatever had been trapped in that chandelier was gone, or at least I desperately hoped so. But sometimes, when the moonlight is particularly bright, I catch glimpses of figures dancing across the foyer floor, not in terror or rage, but in what appears to be celebration. And occasionally I hear the faint sound of a violin, played by hands finally free to create beauty rather than suffer in eternal imprisonment. 3 months after the night of shattered crystal and freed spirits, I had settled into an uneasy routine in the historic mansion. Thomas had returned to his university position, though he called frequently to check on me. We'd agreed not to document our experience, who would believe us, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the house either. Something unfinished lingered in its walls. Winter had descended on Virginia, wrapping the estate in frigid silence. I'd taken to working in the library, transcribing the household ledgers I'd found, searching for more information about the silver-haired man or Friedrich Heinemann's unusual commission. On a particularly cold December evening, as ice formed delicate patterns on the library windows, I discovered another relevant entry, dated nearly a year after the chandelier's installation. May 3, 1813, final payment to Mr. Heinemann for supplementary crystal work in silence, $250, silence about what? The entry raised more questions than it answered. I closed the ledger, rubbing my tired eyes, and became aware of an unusual sound, a rhythmic tapping, like a fingernail against glass, coming from the direction of the foyer. Since that night 3 months ago, the foyer had remained empty where the chandelier had once hung. I'd left the brass mounting chain in place, unable to reach it without specialized equipment, but otherwise there was no trace of the magnificent fixture that had dominated the space. The tapping continued, growing more insistent. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The foyer was bathed in moonlight filtering through tall windows, illuminating the marble floor where frost had formed despite the house's heating system. Standing in the center of this frost pattern was a woman in a cream-colored dress, the same sad-eyed figure I'd glimpsed during my first night in the house. She was more substantial than the spirits I'd seen emerge from the chandelier, looking almost solid except for the moonlight passing through her form. In her outstretched hand, she held a single crystal pendant, one I was certain we had buried with the others. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. Her lips moved, but I heard nothing. She gestured emphatically with the crystal, then pointed toward the garden. When I didn't immediately respond, she moved toward the front door, clearly expecting me to follow. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I grabbed my coat and followed her spectral form into the frigid night air. The garden in winter was a study in black and white, bare branches etched against the night sky like intricate pen strokes. The rose bush where we'd buried the central crystal stood as a tangled mass of thorns, dormant until spring. Or not entirely dormant. As we approached, I noticed an unnatural glow emanating from the soil beneath it. The ghost woman pointed urgently at the ground, her expression plating. "You want me to dig it up?" I asked incredulously. After everything that happened, she nodded vigorously, then held out the crystal pendant she carried. In the moonlight, I could see something moving within it, not a physical object like the grisly relics we'd found before, but what appeared to be trapped light, swirling in distress. I returned to the house for a garden trowel, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. When I returned, the ghost woman waited patiently, the crystal in her hand pulsing with increasing urgency. The ground was partially frozen, making digging difficult, but not impossible. After 20 minutes of effort, my gloved hands struck something hard, the central mirror crystal that had imprisoned the silver-haired man. I expected it to be fractured as we had left it, but to my shock, it appeared to have reformed, the cracks sealed as if they had never existed. Within its depths, shadows moved, not the swirling darkness of that night, but distinct human shapes, miniaturized and trapped. I counted at least a dozen tiny figures pressed against the crystal's interior, their mouths open in silent screams. The ghost woman held out her hand, offering me the smaller crystal she carried. I took it gingerly, surprised to find it warm despite the freezing temperature. Inside, the swirling light had coalesced into the form of a key. Understanding dawned. Whatever ritual or science Heinemann had employed to create his crystal prisons, it hadn't ended with our destruction of the chandelier. The central crystal had reformed, recapturing some of the spirits, but not all of them. Those who remained free, like the woman before me, knighted the prison broken permanently. I placed the key crystal against the larger one, unsure what would happen. For several heartbeats, nothing occurred. Then the smaller crystal began to dissolve, its substance flowing like molten glass into the larger one. Where they merged, a keyhole structure formed within the crystal's depths. The ghost woman knelt beside me, placing her translucent hands on the crystal. Her lips moved in what appeared to be an incantation, though I heard nothing but the winter wind through bare branches. The temperature dropped further, my breath forming thick clouds before me. Suddenly the crystal emitted a high, piercing note, pure as a soprano's highest register, but painful to human ears. I covered my ears as the sound intensified, the crystal beginning to vibrate against the frozen ground. The ghost woman remained focused on her task, her hands now plunged inside the crystal, as if its solid surface offered no resistance to her spectral form. She appeared to be turning something within it, the key we had provided. A crack appeared in the crystal's surface, then another. Unlike the violent shattering of 3 months ago, this was a controlled, deliberate breaking. Each fracture followed a precise pattern, like a puzzle being disassembled piece by piece. As the crystal separated into fragments, the tiny figures trapped inside grew in size, expanding outward until they stood around us in the garden, 12 spirits, men and women in clothing spanning decades of styles, all bearing signs of violent death. Unlike the confused, angry spirits from the chandelier, these souls seemed calm, purposeful. One stepped forward, a middle-aged man in clothing from the early 19th century. When he spoke, his voice was clear despite his transparent appearance. He is not gone. Merely weakened, the silver-haired man, I asked, already knowing the answer. The spirit nodded. Ambrose Blackwood, my father. A man who believed his wealth gave him ownership of lives as well as property. The name triggered a memory from my research into the house's history. Ambrose Blackwood had been the mansion's most notorious owner, a wealthy merchant with political ambitions who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1814. What did he do, I asked, though the evidence of his crimes stood before me in spectral form. What didn't he do? Replied the spirit with a bitter laugh. Murder, torture, dark rituals learned during his travels in Europe. When suspicion finally fell upon him, he sought a way to escape justice, not just in this life, but beyond death itself. The woman in the cream dress stepped forward, her hand slipping into the male spirits with familiar intimacy. When she spoke, her voice was faint but audible. My husband tried to stop his father. We both did. We were the first he sacrificed. The male spirit, Ambrose's son, continued. My father contracted with Friedrich Heinemann, a glassblower rumored to have learned alchemical secrets. Together they created a vessel that could contain souls. the chandelier. Each crystal designed to imprison a specific person. But why, I asked, struggling to comprehend such elaborate cruelty. Power, said another spirit, an elderly man in simple clothing. Lives taken at the moment of death, their energy harvested and contained. Blackwood believed it would grant him immortality. When authorities finally came for him, Ambrose's son explained, he enacted his final ritual, binding his own soul to the central crystal and drawing power from his captives. He has remained there since, feeding on the energy of those trapped with him. I looked at the crystal fragments scattered across the frozen ground. But we destroyed the chandelier. We buried the central crystal. You weakened him, corrected the woman in cream. But his influence remained strong enough to begin rebuilding his prison, recapturing those of us who couldn't flee quickly enough. Some of us managed to remain free, said Ambrose's son. We've been gathering strength, searching for a way to break his hold permanently. The key, I murmured, understanding now the significance of what the ghost woman had brought me. A binding element Heinemann created as insurance against Blackwood's ambitions, confirmed another spirit. We've spent decades searching for it, hidden somewhere in this house. The spirits gathered around the scattered crystal fragments, forming a circle. They joined hands, their translucent forms glowing brighter in the moonlight. The woman in cream looked at me over her shoulder. "This is not your battle," she said kindly. "You should return to the warmth," but I stayed, watching as they began a low chant in a language I didn't recognize. The crystal fragments rose from the ground, hovering at the center of their circle. As their chant intensified, the crystals began to glow red, then white-hot, though they cast no heat in the frigid air. The spirits' forms grew more luminous, their features sharpening until I could see every detail of their faces, all bearing the unmistakable family resemblance to the silver-haired man I had glimpsed. The crystal fragments spun faster, generating a whirlwind of energy that lifted my hair and tugged at my clothing. Within this vortex, a dark shape began to form, humanoid but distorted, with elongated limbs and features twisted by rage. Ambrose Blackwood trying to reconstitute himself. "You cannot banish me," the voice thundered across the garden, though it seemed to emanate from within my own mind rather than the physical space around us. "I am bound to this land, to this bloodline." The spirits tightened their circle, their chant growing more urgent. The woman in cream broke from the formation, approaching me with determined steps. "We need your help," she said, her voice stronger now. "You live here. You have connection to this place. Without your consent, he can claim dominion over the house and rebuild his prison. What do I need to do?" I asked, my teeth chattering from cold and fear. "Deny him," she said simply. "Revoke any permission for him to remain." I stepped forward, focusing on the dark shape struggling to form within the crystal vortex. Drawing on courage I didn't know I possessed, I spoke clearly into the whirlwind. "Ambrose Blackwood, I am the rightful owner of this house. You have no claim here. You have no power here. I revoke any permission, any right, any foothold you may have. This house is mine, and you are not welcome in it." The effect was immediate and violent. The dark shape contorted, its silent scream rippling through the air with such force that frost crystals shattered from nearby tree branches. The whirlwind intensified, spinning the crystal fragments so rapidly they became a blur of light. "This is not over," Blackwood's voice raged, but it was fainter now, more distant. "I will find another way." "No," said his son calmly. "You will not." The spirits closed their circle completely, their joined hands creating a barrier of light. The crystal fragments at the center of their formation began to dissolve, not into solid pieces, but into particles of light that dispersed into the night air. Within this disintegration, Ambrose Blackwood's form stretched and thinned, unable to maintain coherence as his vessel was destroyed. With a final, defiant wail that echoed across the winter landscape, the dark presence shattered into countless motes of darkness that faded against the night sky. The crystal fragments were gone, leaving nothing but a scorched patch on the frozen ground. The spirits released their hands, their forms now growing fainter. The woman in cream approached me, her features already beginning to blur around the edges. "Thank you," she said softly. "We can rest now, all of you?" I asked, looking at the assembled spirits. "All those who were trapped," confirmed Ambrose's son. "But the house has other stories, other echoes. Not all are bound to my father's cruelty." One by one, the spirits faded, their forms dissolving into the moonlight until only the woman in cream remained. She reached out, her hand passing through mine in a touch that felt like a cool breeze. "The house chose you," she whispered. "It has been waiting for someone who could see, who could help. There are more stories in these walls, more memories preserved in objects beyond the chandelier. Some beautiful, some terrible. All seeking witness." With these words, she too faded, leaving me alone in the frozen garden with only the distant hoot of an owl to break the silence. I returned to the house, numb with cold and the weight of what I had witnessed. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not the oppressive presence I had grown accustomed to, but something lighter, almost welcoming. In the library, the household ledger lay open where I had left it, but a new page had been turned. An entry I hadn't seen before caught my eye. April 17, 1814. Funeral expenses for Master Ambrose Blackwood, $10 April 18, 1814. Payment to stonemason for sealing the hidden chamber, $25 April 19, 1814. Commendation to housemaid Eliza for discovery of Master Edward and Mistress Catherine's remains, $5. I stared at the entry, pieces falling into place. Edward Ambrose's son. Catherine, presumably the woman in cream. Their bodies had been hidden somewhere in the house, perhaps in this mysterious hidden chamber. As I contemplated this new information, a floorboard creaked above me. Not the normal settling of an old house, but the deliberate sound of footsteps. Someone or something was moving in the upstairs hallway. I should have been terrified after everything I'd witnessed. Instead, I felt a strange calm as I rose from my chair and moved toward the stairs. The house had chosen me, the woman had said. And there were more stories waiting to be witnessed. Whatever or whoever waited for me upstairs was just another chapter in the long history of this place. And I, for reasons I didn't yet understand, had been selected as its chronicler. As I ascended the staircase, the footsteps above grew more distinct. A door opened and closed. A woman's gentle humming drifted down the hallway. The house was alive with memories, and I was no longer afraid to listen. Spring came to Virginia with explosive force, as if the land itself was eager to shed winter's grip. The gardens of the Blackwood mansion erupted in forgotten splendor, roses climbing trellises, lilacs scenting the air, and daffodils carpeting the lawns with gold. I had spent the intervening months exploring the house, documenting its secrets, and learning to coexist with its more permanent residents. For they were still here, not Ambrose Blackwood or his immediate victims, but dozens of others who had lived and died within these walls over 2 centuries. Unlike the trapped spirits of the chandelier, these echoes moved freely through the house, most barely aware of my presence. A Revolutionary War soldier who paced the East Wing, forever standing guard. A young woman in Victorian dress who played the pianoforte in the music room, her fingers passing through the keys, yet somehow producing the faintest melody. A pair of children who raced through the gardens at twilight, their laughter like wind chimes in the distance. I had learned to recognize the signs of their presence, sudden temperature changes, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume, objects subtly rearranged. The house was a repository of memories, and I had become its archivist. Thomas visited occasionally, his academic skepticism permanently shattered by what we had witnessed. He brought equipment, EMF detectors, thermal cameras, audio recorders, but the spirits seemed to retreat from these scientific intrusions, preferring to reveal themselves in more subtle ways. "You know you're living in the academic discovery of the century," he reminded me during one such visit. "We could publish present evidence and turn this house into a circus," I countered. "They deserve their peace." On the anniversary of the night we had destroyed the chandelier, I woke to find a small crystal pendant on my bedside table, not one of the macabre prison cells from Blackwood's creation, but something newer, clearer. Within it, light moved like liquid gold, warm and inviting. Beside it lay a note written in flowing script I didn't recognize. "The hidden chamber awaits." The truth of the house lies beneath. I had spent months searching for the hidden chamber mentioned in the ledger, tapping walls and examining floorboards throughout the mansion. This crystal, I somehow knew, was the key I had been seeking. In the cellar, among dusty wine racks and forgotten storage, I found a section of wall that responded differently to the crystal's presence. When I held the pendant against the rough stone, it grew warm in my hand, its internal light pulsing like a heartbeat. The wall before me rippled, stone becoming momentarily translucent, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. I hesitated only briefly before stepping through, the crystal pendant lighting my way like a miniature lantern. The passage descended steeply, taking me far below the foundation of the house. The air grew colder, heavier with each step, yet remained surprisingly fresh. After perhaps 100 feet, the passage opened into a circular chamber carved from bedrock. At its center stood a pedestal of white marble, upon which rested a leather-bound book so ancient its binding had cracked and faded. Around the chamber's perimeter, niches had been carved into the stone walls, each containing a small object, a thimble, a pocket watch, a child's wooden top, a tarnished locket. As I approached the pedestal, the crystal pendant grew brighter, illuminating the entire chamber. The book seemed to respond to the light, its cover shifting slightly as if disturbed by an invisible hand. I opened it carefully, expecting fragile pages that might crumble at my touch. Instead, the paper was surprisingly supple, the ink unfaded. The first page bore a single sentence in the same flowing script as the note on my bedside table. "The House of Memories welcomes its new keeper." I turned the page to find a detailed account of the house's construction in 1787, written in a different hand. The next page chronicled the birth of the builder's first child, the ink slightly shakier. Page after page documented the lives lived within these walls, joys and sorrows, births and deaths, ordinary moments and extraordinary events. Different handwritings appeared throughout the book, sometimes changing mid-sentence, as if the chronicle had been maintained by multiple authors working in concert. The final written page ended with an account of my great-aunt Eleanor's death and my inheritance of the property. The rest of the book remained blank, waiting. I looked up from the tome to find I was no longer alone in the chamber. Around me stood dozens of translucent figures, every spirit I had glimpsed in the house over the past months, and many more I had never seen. They formed a circle around the pedestal, their expressions solemn yet expectant. From among them stepped a woman I recognized from portraits hanging in the dining room, my great-aunt Eleanor, looking much younger than I had ever known her. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Every house has a story," she said, "but few have a keeper to preserve it. This house has stood for over 2 centuries, witnessing the full measure of human experience, love and hatred, generosity and greed, birth and death. All of it echoes here, imprinted in stone and wood and memory." She gestured to the niches around the chamber. "Each object retains the essence of its owner, a connection to their strongest memories, their unfinished business. Ambrose Blackwood perverted this natural phenomenon, forcing spirits to remain bound to crystal prisons. But this house has always been a sanctuary for memories, willingly preserved. Why me?" I asked, my voice barely audible in the hushed chamber. "The house chooses its keeper," Elena replied simply. "Someone with the sensitivity to perceive its echoes, the compassion to honor its stories, and the strength to protect it from those who would exploit its power." Another spirit stepped forward, a tall man in colonial-era clothing whom I recognized as the house's original builder from portraits in the library. "Each keeper serves as both witness and guardian," he explained. "You will document what transpires here, preserve the memories that linger, and ensure that no one ever again attempts to imprison spirits as Blackwood did." "But I'm a historian," I protested. "Not a... Whatever this is," Eleanor smiled. "Why do you think you were drawn to history in the first place? You've always been sensitive to echoes of the past. This house simply amplifies what was already within you." I looked down at the book, then at the crystal pendant in my hand. "What exactly am I supposed to do?" "Listen," said the builder. "Record, witness, protect, and what if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then the house will find another," Eleanor said gently. "But it has chosen you for a reason. The choice, however, must be yours." I considered what acceptance would mean, a life intertwined with echoes of the past, serving as custodian to memories not my own. Yet hadn't I already chosen this path by becoming a historian? Wasn't I already devoted to preserving the stories of those who came before? I placed my hand on the open book, feeling a subtle vibration beneath my fingertips. I accept. The spirits around me seem to exhale collectively, their forms momentarily brightening. Eleanor approached, placing her translucent hand over mine on the book. "The position of keeper comes with certain abilities," she said. "You will find yourself more attuned to the memories contained within objects. You will be able to perceive layers of time others cannot. And you will live a very long life should you choose to remain." "Great-aunt Eleanor," I said, suddenly understanding. "You were the previous keeper," she nodded. "For nearly 70 years. I would have continued, but my time was drawing to a close, and the house needed someone younger, someone with fresh eyes. Why didn't you tell me?" In life, I mean, would you have believed me? She asked with a knowing smile. Some things must be experienced to be understood. The builder gestured to a pen that had appeared beside the book. Your first entry awaits. Record what you have witnessed, what you have learned. Begin your stewardship. I picked up the pen, its weight perfectly balanced in my hand. As I began to write, the spirits around me faded gradually, returning to their respective places and times within the house. Only Alina remained, watching as I documented the story of the chandelier and the liberation of its prisoners. There will be more, she said as I finished. This house has accumulated countless stories over 2 centuries. Some you will discover in objects, others in the spirits themselves. Each has value. Each deserves remembrance. She began to fade, her form growing transparent. Visit this chamber when you need guidance. We are always here, just beyond the veil of perception. Wait, I called as she dimmed. How will I know what to do? Her voice came as a whisper as she disappeared entirely. The house will guide you. Trust its wisdom. Trust yourself. I closed the book, feeling its leather binding warm beneath my fingers. The crystal pendant pulsed with gentle light, illuminating my path back up the narrow passage. In the months that followed, I settled into my role as keeper with growing confidence. I learned to recognize the subtle energies of different spirits, to differentiate between a mere echo, a moment replayed endlessly without consciousness, and an actual presence aware of its surroundings. I documented everything in the book, which never seemed to run out of pages despite my daily entries. Sometimes I would return to the chamber to find additional notes added in different handwriting, clarifications or context provided by previous keepers whose spirits remained connected to the house. Thomas continued his visits, though I never revealed the full extent of my new role. He noticed the change in me, a new certainty, a deeper connection to the house, but attributed it to my growing comfort with the supernatural aspects of my inheritance. You've gone native, he teased during one such visit. Talking about the house like it's a person. Maybe it is in a way, I replied. Not a single consciousness, but a collective one, layers upon layers of experience and memory. He shook his head, smiling. Whatever it is, it suits you. I've never seen you so. At peace, and I was at peace, despite the occasional unsettling encounter with a spirit trapped in trauma or confusion. I had found my purpose in this strange intersection of history and mystery, the tangible and intangible. One evening, as summer faded into autumn, I sat in the library transcribing my notes. The crystal pendant, now worn on a chain around my neck, pulsed warmly against my skin. I looked up to find the woman in cream, Catherine, standing before me, more solid than I had ever seen her. You've done well, she said, her voice clear in the quiet room. The house is healing from what? I asked. From Ambrose's corruption. From the violence and pain that seeped into its foundations. Memories need not be prisons. They can be honored without being relived in torment. She moved to the window, looking out at the gardens now ablaze with autumn colors. New memories are being created here now. Peaceful ones, joyful ones. The balance is being restored. I joined her at the window, following her gaze to where the rose bush grew over the spot where we had destroyed the crystal fragments. It had bloomed continuously since spring, its flowers unusually large and vibrant. Life from death, Catherine said softly. The way it should be, will you stay? I asked. Now that you're free, she turned to me, her expression serene. For a time. There are still stories I wish to witness, still moments I wish to share. But eventually, when the house no longer needs our protection, Edward and I will move on together. She placed her hand near mine on the windowsill, not quite touching, but close enough that I felt the coolness of her presence. Until then, we are here. All of us. Witnesses to the past, guardians of the present, stewards of the future. As twilight deepened into night, I watched the first stars appear above the ancient trees surrounding the house. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint sound of a violin, not a memory this time, but Thomas practicing in the guest room where he now stayed with increasing frequency. New memories forming, layering over the old without erasing them. The house absorbing it all, growing richer with each passing day. I touched the crystal pendant at my throat, feeling its gentle pulse synchronize with my heartbeat. The keeper and the house, now bound in a symbiotic relationship that would endure for decades to come. Behind me, Catherine had vanished, returned to whatever realm she occupied when not manifesting in our world. But I wasn't alone. I would never be alone here. The house of memories had found its keeper, and I had found my home. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.